The guns had fallen silent over the deserts of North Africa. The once feared Afrika Korps, who had driven deep into Egypt under Rommel's command, were now broken, exhausted, and defeated. In the spring of 1943, under a blazing Tunisian sun, more than 250,000 Axis troops laid down their arms. Among them were tens of thousands of German soldiers who had believed themselves part of an unstoppable army, the spearhead of Hitler's New Europe. Instead, they were prisoners. For many, the war had ended not with glory, but with surrender. They were marched through dust and heat, past the wreckage of tanks and trucks that had once carried their pride, to the ports where ships awaited them. These vessels would take them far from the battlefields they knew, across an ocean they had never seen, to a place they only knew through propaganda, the United States of America. As they crowded the decks, watching the African coast fade behind them, they spoke of what awaited. Some feared the worst: harsh captivity, hunger, perhaps even death. Others clung to the lies they had been told by Goebbels' propaganda machine, that America was weak, divided, a nation of mongrels and millionaires, barely able to fight. They believed they would find a land on the brink of chaos, not the great power the Allies claimed it to be. But when their ships reached New York Harbor in the summer of 1943, the prisoners fell silent. Towering before them was a city unlike anything they had ever imagined. The Statue of Liberty rose through the morning mist, and behind it, the steel canyons of Manhattan glimmered with light. Even in wartime, the city was alive, electric, confident, untouched by destruction. One German soldier would later write in his diary, "We expected ruins and chaos. Instead, we saw a city that looked untouched by war. Lights everywhere, endless lights. I thought, this cannot be the enemy." As they disembarked, the realization began to sink in. The nation they had mocked was not crumbling, it was thriving. Trains roared past carrying endless supplies. Ships lined the docks, loaded with weapons, food, and fuel. American factories were producing more in a single month than Germany could in half a year. The myth of a lazy America evaporated before their eyes. When they finally reached the camps, they braced for punishment. But instead of brutality, they found order. Clean barracks, running water, hot meals, and even medical care. The Geneva Convention was not just a paper promise here, it was enforced. Each man received work, pay, and mail from home. They were allowed to organize sports, music, and even education. The guards treated them firmly, but fairly. For many, it was their first encounter with democracy, not as an idea, but as a way of life. At night, when the camp fell quiet, some prisoners gathered to talk. They spoke in low voices about what they had seen. One man, once a loyal Nazi, whispered to another that the American guards, simple farm boys and factory workers, were living better than the German aristocracy. Another wondered how a nation with so much abundance could be losing patience for war. Some refused to believe it. Others began to doubt everything they had been taught. Thousands of miles away, in bombed-out German cities, their families lived under rationing, fear, and propaganda. But here, in the heart of their enemy's land, there was no hunger. No blackouts. Even during wartime, the lights of America never went out. For these prisoners, the sight of an illuminated town at night was enough to break something inside them, the illusion of superiority they had carried from home. In their letters, they tried to describe what they saw, though most knew their words would be censored. Still, fragments made it through. "The Americans are not what we were told," one wrote. "They have more than we ever dreamed of. Factories everywhere. Roads that never end. People who seem free." Some of the guards noticed the change. The prisoners who once marched stiffly, saluting Hitler's portrait, began to relax. They worked with farmers, picked cotton, repaired machinery, built roads. Slowly, distrust turned into curiosity, and curiosity into quiet respect. A few even began to teach German to American soldiers, while others learned English. They weren't being converted by propaganda, they were being convinced by reality. What began as captivity was turning into something else, an education in freedom. The same men who once believed in conquest were learning about coexistence. The same soldiers who thought democracy was weak were living proof of its strength. Behind the barbed wire, the transformation had begun. By the time lights went out each night, the camp would fall silent except for the distant hum of trains and factory whistles. Lying in their bunks, These German soldiers stared at the stars above foreign soil and wondered if everything they had fought for had been built on lies. Their defeat had taken their weapons. But what they saw in America, its strength, its abundance, its humanity, began to take something else, their faith in the Reich itself. For many, the war had ended the day they were captured. But for others, it was just beginning, not a battle of bullets, but of truth. By the summer of 1943, more than 100 ships had crossed the Atlantic, carrying tens of thousands of German prisoners to America's shores. They were scattered across the heartland, far from battlefields and oceans, into over 500 prison camps that stretched from California's deserts to the farmlands of Iowa, from the forests of Wisconsin to the cotton fields of Texas. At first, the barbed wire fences and guard towers looked like symbols of defeat. But soon, many prisoners realized these fences were not prisons. They were boundaries to a new world they had never imagined. Inside them, something extraordinary was happening. Each morning, the camps came alive with the sound of bugles, footsteps, and distant factory whistles. American officers kept a disciplined routine, but they also followed rules that shocked the prisoners. Unlike the SS or Gestapo, these guards didn't shout or strike. They gave orders firmly, but with dignity. They treated us like men, one former soldier recalled years later. It confused us. We had been taught that Americans were animals. But these men had honor. Every POW received 3 meals a day: meat, vegetables, even coffee, better food than what many civilians were getting back home in Germany. They had clean uniforms, books, and newspapers. The camps had orchestras, soccer leagues, and classrooms where American teachers volunteered to educate their former enemies. Some Germans took English lessons. Others studied engineering, mathematics, or democracy itself. To keep their minds and hands busy, prisoners were allowed to work, not as slaves, but as laborers under the Geneva Convention. They worked in sawmills, on farms, and in canning factories. And for every day of work, they were paid small wages that could be used in the camp canteen to buy tobacco, candy, or writing paper. In return, America solved a wartime labor shortage while showing its humanity. It was a quiet exchange, labor for dignity. One afternoon in Kansas, a farmer named Jack Thompson stood beside a captured German who had been sent to help harvest wheat. The prisoner watched as endless fields of golden grain rippled in the wind. He had never seen such abundance. "How can your people eat all this?" he asked. Thompson smiled. "We don't," he said. "We feed the world." That moment stayed with the German for the rest of his life. Later he wrote in his diary, "I saw with my own eyes the wealth of this land. The barns were full. The people were free. This is not the weak America we were told about." But not all prisoners changed so easily. Inside many camps, fanatical Nazis still clung to Hitler's ideology. They organized secret groups, intimidated others, and tried to enforce loyalty to the Führer. Those who questioned the Reich were labeled traitors, sometimes beaten, sometimes even murdered in the shadows of their own barracks. The American guards began to notice the divide: 2 armies within one fence. On one side were the blacks, the die-hard Nazis who refused to let go. On the other were the grays, those beginning to doubt. It became a war of whispers, fought not with guns but with ideas. To counter this silent war, the U.S. Army launched a bold experiment: re-education. But it wasn't propaganda. There were no lectures about democracy, no forced confessions. Instead, the Americans showed, not told, what freedom looked like. They screened films about American life, let prisoners read newspapers, and even allowed them to debate. The results were astonishing. Some prisoners who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler began writing essays about freedom and justice. Others publicly renounced Nazism. And perhaps the most powerful lessons weren't taught in classrooms at all, but witnessed in daily life, in the calm discipline of a guard, in the honesty of a farmer, in the kindness of a nurse treating a wounded enemy. Still, back in Germany, the war raged on. The Reich's propaganda ministry painted a different picture. German radio declared that prisoners in America were being tortured or starved. But letters smuggled home told another story, of safety, abundance, and respect. Many of these letters were censored, but even the smallest hints, "We are well, the Americans are fair," spoke volumes to the families who read between the lines. One prisoner wrote to his wife, "When I came here, I thought I knew the truth. Now I am not so sure. These people build a plane every hour. Their children laugh in the streets. They fight hard, but they do not hate. If this is weakness, then I wish Germany were weak." By 1944, the transformation was spreading quietly through the camps. The men who had once dreamed of Hitler's victory were beginning to dream of Germany's survival, not through conquest, but through peace. They started small discussion groups, printing secret newspapers that analyzed why the war was lost. For many, it was the first time they were allowed to think freely without fear. Meanwhile, outside the fences, America's industry thundered like a giant machine. Each day, B-24 bombers rolled out of factories in Michigan, Texas, and California, one every 63 minutes. Tanks, jeeps, rifles, and ships were produced in numbers that defied comprehension. The POWs who worked in nearby industries saw this firsthand. They realized that Germany had never stood a chance against such an industrial force. The illusion was gone. The men who had once called America soft now saw it for what it was: powerful, organized, unstoppable. And yet, what shocked them most was not America's power, but its mercy. While their own homeland burned under Allied bombs, these soldiers, the enemy, were given warmth, safety, and dignity. Some would later call it the weapon that conquered us without firing a shot. As 1944 turned to 1945, whispers spread through the camps of Germany's collapse. Hitler was losing. The Reich was dying. And soon, these men, who had come as prisoners, would have to decide what kind of Germany they wanted to return to. Would they carry home the hatred that had destroyed their nation, or the humanity that had saved them? By early 1945, the snow had melted across the American heartland, and with it, the last illusions of invincibility among the German prisoners. The same men who had once marched under the swastika now stood silently in the fields of Texas, Kansas, and Alabama, picking fruit, repairing fences, or reading American newspapers that told a truth their own leaders had denied. The Reich was dying. And with every headline, every broadcast, every rumor, a part of their old faith died too. Inside the camps, the radio was both a lifeline and a wound. Reports of Allied troops crossing the Rhine sent whispers through the barracks. News of Dresden's destruction brought stunned silence. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others wept openly. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was ending, not in triumph, but in ruins. For many of the older soldiers, it was unbearable. They had grown up in a Germany humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, told that Nazism was their redemption, their pride restored. Now, they watched that pride crumble to dust. The young ones, those barely 20, were torn between loyalty and reality. Some still clung to the belief that Hitler had a secret weapon, a miracle that would turn the war around. Others had seen too much truth to believe any longer. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, one prisoner stared at a photograph in a newspaper: American troops shaking hands with Soviet soldiers at the Elbe River. He turned to his bunkmate and said softly, "So it's over." His voice was flat, not angry, just empty. That night, he tore the swastika patch from his uniform and threw it into the stove. But even as some let go, others grew more fanatical. Within the camps, a shadow war continued. Hardline Nazis, the so-called blacks, saw every sign of defeat as proof of betrayal. They accused others of treason, of weakness. Secret trials were held in barracks under cover of darkness. A few men were beaten to death for refusing to salute Hitler's picture. The Americans watched closely but intervened cautiously. They knew that force would only feed Nazi martyrdom. Instead, they used patience, information, and exposure. They opened libraries filled with banned German authors, Thomas Mann, Goethe, Nietzsche, and allowed the prisoners to read what the Reich had forbidden. Truth became the most effective weapon, and truth began to win. When word reached the camps that Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, the reaction was unlike anything the guards had ever seen. Some prisoners sat in stunned silence. Others broke down completely, their faces in their hands. A few shouted that it was Allied propaganda. But deep down they knew. The man who had promised them victory had abandoned them to defeat. In the mess hall of Camp Swift, Texas, a German sergeant stood up, trembling. "So this is how it ends," he said. "Not in glory, not in Berlin, but here, in a foreign land, surrounded by the men we were taught to hate." He sat down again, eyes hollow. The room stayed silent. The following days were filled with confusion. Some prisoners refused to eat. Others demanded to know what would happen to their families, their homes, their country. The American officers tried to answer with compassion, but there were no easy words. Germany was a wasteland, its cities burned, its people starving, its future uncertain. Then came the photographs. When the Allies liberated the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, the world saw the full horror of what Nazism had built. Those images reached the POW camps in America. The guards didn't hide them. They posted the photographs on notice boards, left newspapers on tables, allowed the prisoners to see for themselves. At first, many refused to believe. "It's fake," they said. "Allied lies." But as more reports came, and as some prisoners recognized faces of men they had once served with, guards, officers, commanders, denial turned to shock and shame. One man, a former SS corporal, stared for a long time at a picture from Dachau, piles of bodies beside the crematorium. He whispered, "We fought for this?" Then he walked outside, sat down in the dirt, and cried. That moment, repeated in hundreds of camps across America, marked something deeper than surrender. It was the death of an idea, the collapse of a poisoned faith that had consumed a generation. The Americans didn't celebrate their prisoners' grief. They didn't mock them. Instead, they showed quiet empathy. Some guards offered comfort. Others shared cigarettes. They knew this was not just the defeat of an army, it was the rebirth of a conscience. In one camp, an American chaplain held a Sunday service and invited the German prisoners to attend. Dozens came, some out of curiosity, others out of guilt. The chaplain read from the Gospel of John, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." No one spoke. But afterward, a German lieutenant approached him and said, "For the first time in my life, I understand those words." By the summer of 1945, the war was officially over. But for these men, thousands of miles from home, the true battle had just begun, the battle for their own souls. They had seen America's power. They had seen its humanity. Now they had to decide which lesson they would take back to the ruins of their homeland. Would they rebuild Germany in the image of tyranny, or in the image of freedom? The sun scorched the endless sand of North Africa. The desert shimmered like a sea of fire, and every grain of sand seemed to whisper the same truth. This land belonged to no one, yet everyone wanted it. It was 1941. The North African campaign had become a brutal chessboard of survival, where tanks were kings, and water was more precious than bullets. As the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel advanced, the British Eighth Army found itself pushed back again and again. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had earned his name. He was cunning, swift, and unpredictable. His panzers struck like lightning across the dunes, disappearing before the enemy could react. The British troops called him a ghost. But behind his legend was the harsh reality of war, scorched throats, cracked lips, endless marches, and the ever-present mirage of victory. From the skies, RAF Hurricanes and German Stukas dueled under the blazing sun. Each sortie ended in smoke, sand, and shattered metal raining down over the desert. The wind carried the echo of engines and the cries of men who fought not for glory, but for survival. In April 1941, Rommel launched an audacious offensive. He recaptured Benghazi and surrounded Tobruk, a key Allied fortress on the Libyan coast. The siege would last 8 long months. Inside Tobruk, Australian, British, and Polish soldiers dug in. They became known as the Rats of Tobruk, a name they wore with pride. Night after night, the defenders endured relentless bombardments. The air smelled of cordite and dust. Shells whistled through the darkness. Yet, the men inside Tobruk refused to yield. They patched their wounds, cleaned their rifles, and waited for dawn. Outside, Rommel's men, the cream of the Afrika Korps, faced their own torment. Their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Tanks broke down, engines choked with sand, and fuel convoys fell prey to Allied air raids. This was a war not just between armies, but between men and the desert itself. By late 1941, reinforcements began to arrive for the Allies. Operation Crusader was set in motion, a massive counterattack aimed at lifting the siege of Tobruk. The British Eighth Army surged forward, wave after wave, across the dunes. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Dust clouds rose higher than buildings. Tank treads bit into the sand as steel monsters collided head-on. Gunfire echoed through the empty plains like thunder in a storm. Inside one British tank, Sergeant Collins shouted over the roar of the engine. Sweat poured down his face as he sighted an approaching panzer. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He fired. The shell hit. A blinding explosion swallowed the horizon. Rommel's forces counterattacked with the precision of a master tactician. He struck the British flanks, then vanished into the dunes, only to reappear miles away. His brilliance seemed unstoppable, until his fuel ran dry. By December, the Allies had pushed Rommel back. Tobruk was free. But both sides had learned a painful truth. Victory in the desert came at an unbearable cost. As 1941 drew to a close, Rommel regrouped. He was not beaten, only delayed. The sands would soon shift again. And somewhere in Cairo, British commanders pored over maps, their faces grim. The Desert War was far from over. The next battle would decide not just North Africa, but the future of the Mediterranean itself. The desert had become a crucible, burning away weakness, leaving only endurance, courage, and the will to fight on. Because in this inferno, only the strongest could survive. The sun scorched the endless sand of North Africa. The desert shimmered like a sea of fire, and every grain of sand seemed to whisper the same truth. This land belonged to no one, yet everyone wanted it. It was 1941. The North African campaign had become a brutal chessboard of survival, where tanks were kings, and water was more precious than bullets. As the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel advanced, the British Eighth Army found itself pushed back again and again. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had earned his name. He was cunning, swift, and unpredictable. His panzers struck like lightning across the dunes, disappearing before the enemy could react. The British troops called him a ghost. But behind his legend was the harsh reality of war: scorched throats, cracked lips, endless marches, and the ever-present mirage of victory. From the skies, RAF Hurricanes and German Stukas dueled under the blazing sun. Each sortie ended in smoke, sand, and shattered metal raining down over the desert. The wind carried the echo of engines and the cries of men who fought not for glory, but for survival. In April 1941, Rommel launched an audacious offensive. He recaptured Benghazi and surrounded Tobruk, a key Allied fortress on the Libyan coast. The siege would last 8 long months. Inside Tobruk, Australian, British, and Polish soldiers dug in. They became known as the Rats of Tobruk, a name they wore with pride. Night after night, the defenders endured relentless bombardments. The air smelled of cordite and dust. Shells whistled through the darkness. Yet, the men inside Tobruk refused to yield. They patched their wounds, cleaned their rifles, and waited for dawn. Outside, Rommel's men, the cream of the Afrika Korps, faced their own torment. Their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Tanks broke down, engines choked with sand, and fuel convoys fell prey to Allied air raids. This was a war not just between armies, but between men and the desert itself. By late 1941, reinforcements began to arrive for the Allies. Operation Crusader was set in motion, a massive counterattack aimed at lifting the siege of Tobruk. The British Eighth Army surged forward, wave after wave, across the dunes. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Dust clouds rose higher than buildings. Tank treads bit into the sand as steel monsters collided head-on. Gunfire echoed through the empty plains like thunder in a storm. Inside one British tank, Sergeant Collins shouted over the roar of the engine. Sweat poured down his face as he sighted an approaching panzer. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He fired. The shell hit. A blinding explosion swallowed the horizon. Rommel's forces counterattacked with the precision of a master tactician. He struck the British flanks, then vanished into the dunes, only to reappear miles away. His brilliance seemed unstoppable, until his fuel ran dry. By December, the Allies had pushed Rommel back. Tobruk was free. But both sides had learned a painful truth: victory in the desert came at an unbearable cost. As 1941 drew to a close, Rommel regrouped. He was not beaten, only delayed. The sands would soon shift again. And somewhere in Cairo, British commanders pored over maps, their faces grim. The Desert War was far from over. The next battle would decide not just North Africa, but the future of the Mediterranean itself. The desert had become a crucible, burning away weakness, leaving only endurance, courage, and the will to fight on. Because in this inferno, only the strongest could survive. The victory at El Alamein had lit a spark. For the first time in years, the Allies had momentum. But the desert campaign was far from over, and across the Atlantic, a new chapter of the war was being written. It was November 1942. The Atlantic winds carried whispers of something enormous. The Allies were about to launch the first major American-led operation of World War II, a gamble that would test their courage, coordination, and conviction. Its name, Operation Torch. This was not just an invasion, it was the opening strike of a global counteroffensive. The goal was clear: land Allied forces on the coasts of French North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, then advance east to trap Rommel's Afrika Korps between Montgomery's advancing 8th Army and the new American forces. But there was one problem. North Africa was controlled not by the Germans, but by Vichy France, French forces loyal to a government cooperating with Hitler. Would they fight? Would they surrender? Or would they switch sides? No one knew. On the night of November 7, 1942, under the cover of darkness, a massive armada of over 850 ships crossed the stormy Atlantic. Aboard were more than 100,000 American and British troops, soldiers who had never seen combat before. They were seasick, cold, and terrified, but determined. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man chosen to command the operation, watched the convoy in silence. He was calm, methodical, a soldier who believed in teamwork above glory. For him, this invasion wasn't just about land. It was about proving that America could fight and win. The first landings began before dawn. At Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, the sea was alive with the thunder of engines, the crash of waves, and the shriek of shells. Landing craft dropped their ramps, and young men from Kansas, New York, and London charged into the unknown. They were met with gunfire. French coastal batteries opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked through the dark like fiery needles. The beaches erupted into chaos. But something unexpected happened. French officers began to hesitate. Some refused to fire. Others joined the Allies outright. In Algiers, a group of French resistance fighters rose up from within the city, sabotaging communication lines and capturing Vichy officers before the landings even began. Within 72 hours, the impossible had happened. The French surrendered across North Africa. The tricolor flag, red, white, and blue, flew once again beside the stars and stripes. But Hitler was furious. He ordered German troops into Tunisia, determined to keep his foothold in Africa. Within days, Luftwaffe bombers roared over the ports of Algiers and Bizerta, strafing Allied supply ships. Rommel, retreating from El Alamein, now found new reinforcements waiting for him. The Desert War was merging with a new front, and the Americans were about to meet the enemy head-on. For the young U.S. soldiers, this was a brutal awakening. The war they'd trained for suddenly became real, the air thick with smoke, the sky black with planes, the sand stained red. But as the Allies dug in across Algeria and Tunisia, something else began to happen. American and British soldiers, once divided by inexperience and distrust, began to fight as one. The logistical miracle of Operation Torch, moving men, tanks, and supplies halfway around the world, had worked. The Americans had landed. The Allies had secured North Africa. And the Germans were on notice. Still, the hardest battles were yet to come, in the mountains of Tunisia, where Rommel would strike again, and where the Green American Army would face its baptism of fire. For now, though, Eisenhower's gamble had paid off. From London to Washington, church bells rang. For the first time, American troops stood victorious on enemy soil. The tide of war had begun to turn, not just in the sands of Africa, but in the hearts of men. The Allies had taken their first step toward Europe, and toward ultimate victory. The early victories in North Africa had filled the Allies with confidence. Operation Torch was a success, the French had switched sides, and the dream of driving the Axis out of Africa felt within reach. But confidence can be dangerous, especially against a man like Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. It was February 1943. The jagged mountains of Tunisia loomed under the scorching sun. The air was heavy with sand and fear. American soldiers, fresh from training camps in Georgia and Texas, were about to face their first true test against one of the most experienced commanders in the world. They didn't know it yet, but the Battle of Kasserine Pass would change everything. Rommel was cornered, low on fuel, short on men, and under orders to hold Tunisia at all costs. But the German general still had one weapon left: his genius for surprise. He studied the terrain, the narrow valleys, and the steep ridges of the Atlas Mountains, and saw a chance to strike. Across the front lines, the Americans held defensive positions in scattered units. They were brave, well-equipped, but green. Their officers were learning on the job. Their soldiers had never faced a real blitzkrieg. Rommel saw weakness, and he pounced. At dawn on February 14, 1943, the German 10th Panzer Division and 21st Panzer Division roared through the passes. Tiger tanks led the way, their engines growling like beasts from another world. Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead, unleashing their sirens, the sound of terror itself. The desert exploded. American troops at Fade Pass were the first to be hit. Shells ripped through their lines, trucks burst into flames, and young soldiers, some barely 19, faced the brutal truth of modern warfare. The radios crackled with confusion. Orders were unclear. Units became separated. By the afternoon, Rommel's armored columns had driven deep into American positions. Tanks clashed in the dust, Shermans against Panzers. The U.S. 1st Armored Division fought bravely but was outmaneuvered at every turn. Rommel's tactics were lightning fast, his movements unpredictable. At Kasserine Pass, the narrow gateway between two ridges, the full force of the German attack struck. American lines buckled. Some units broke and retreated in panic. Others held their ground to the last bullet. A young American captain, surrounded by smoke and chaos, shouted over the noise, "Hold the line! Don't give them the pass!" He was killed moments later by a shell burst. The Germans advanced, capturing hundreds of vehicles, supplies, and even American soldiers. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire Allied position in Tunisia would collapse. But Rommel's success came at a cost. His supply lines stretched thin, and his fuel was nearly gone. The Americans, though bloodied, began to regroup. General Dwight Eisenhower, shocked by the losses, moved quickly. He replaced incompetent officers and put General George S. Patton in command. Patton, fierce, disciplined, and relentless, was exactly the kind of man America needed now. He barked at his troops, "You're not beaten. You're green, that's all. You'll learn." And they did. By February 22nd, the tide began to shift. American artillery rained down on German positions, cutting off their advance. British reinforcements closed in from the east. Rommel, out of fuel and facing encirclement, was forced to retreat. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. More than 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a defeat, but one that would become a turning point. In the aftermath, something changed in the American army. Gone was the inexperience, the overconfidence. In its place, discipline, unity, and fire. Patton's reforms whipped the troops into shape. The men who had fled at Kasserine would soon be the same ones who stormed the beaches of Normandy. Even Rommel, writing later, admitted respect for his young adversaries. "They were untested," he said, "but brave, and fast learners." The Americans had been bloodied, but not broken. The lesson of Kasserine Pass would echo across the rest of the war, a harsh reminder that victory comes only through struggle, sacrifice, and the will to rise after defeat. The desert had humbled them, but the desert had also forged them. The echoes of Kasserine Pass still lingered across the Tunisian hills. The burned wrecks of tanks and trucks stood like silent monuments to the brutal lessons of war. But for the Allies, that defeat had sparked something far greater: determination. By March 1943, the transformation was complete. Under General George S. Patton's fierce leadership, American forces had hardened into a disciplined, coordinated army. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, pressed from the east. From the west, the newly reformed U.S. II Corps began its advance. Between them stood the legendary Afrika Korps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. But even legends can bleed. Rommel's once unstoppable army was now cornered, low on fuel, and outnumbered 5-1. Supplies had to cross the Mediterranean under constant Allied air raids. Every drop of gasoline, every crate of ammunition, was fought for like gold. Still, Rommel fought on. In early March, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack at Mareth Line, an old French fortification in southern Tunisia. The fighting was savage. Artillery thundered across the desert, and night skies turned red from tracer fire. British tanks rolled forward, crushing mines beneath their treads. Rommel commanded with his usual brilliance, striking where the Allies least expected, using every trick the desert had taught him. But the tide had turned. The Allies had learned from their mistakes. Their air power dominated the skies. Their logistics, once chaotic, now ran like clockwork. The Mareth line crumbled. Rommel withdrew northward, toward El Hama and then Enfidaville. His army pursued every step of the way. His soldiers, hungry, exhausted, and outgunned, fought with desperate courage. But courage could no longer match the Allies' sheer industrial might. In 1 week, Allied bombers dropped more explosives than the Luftwaffe could manage in an entire month. On March 9, 1943, Rommel flew to meet Hitler in Germany. The Führer ordered him to fight to the last man. Rommel knew it was madness. His men were dying for nothing. Broken in spirit and suffering from illness, the Desert Fox was relieved of command and sent home. He would never see Africa again. His replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, inherited a hopeless situation. The Afrika Korps was trapped, squeezed between Patton's Americans and Montgomery's British forces. In April, the Allies launched Operation Vulcan, the final assault on Tunisia. Columns of Shermans rolled north through mountain passes, while Spitfires and P-38s screamed overhead, strafing anything that moved. The Germans and Italians fought stubbornly, village by village, hill by hill. But there was no escape. By May 7th, British forces captured Tunis, and the Americans entered Bizerta. 5 days later, it was over. The once proud Afrika Korps, the same army that had terrorized the desert for 2 years, surrendered. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were captured, including generals, tank commanders, and Luftwaffe aces. It was the largest surrender since Stalingrad. For the Allies, it was a moment of triumph. The Mediterranean was secure, and North Africa, the gateway to Europe, was now theirs. The road to Sicily, to Italy, and eventually to Normandy, lay open. But amid the cheers and celebration, there was also reflection. The Desert Campaign had claimed tens of thousands of lives. It had turned green recruits into veterans. It had shown the world that technology, strategy, and courage must walk hand in hand. On a quiet evening, as the sun set over the Tunisian sands, a British war correspondent wrote, "The desert is silent again. The wind blows over the graves of men who came from every corner of the earth. And though their flags were different, they all faced the same sun, the same dust, and the same death." The war would rage on, across Sicily, Italy, and France. But the spirit forged in the North African sands would guide the Allies through every battle that followed. For in the end, it was not just tanks or planes that won the Desert War. It was endurance, unity, and the unbreakable will to fight on. The Desert Fox was gone. The Afrika Korps was no more. And the sands of North Africa, once soaked with blood and oil, now belonged to history.